get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, US, the Washington home of the IISS. My name is Bryce Campbell. I'm the Managing Director of the IISS US. For those of you who do not yet know us well, the IISS is a global think tank headquartered in London, but with research teams and offices in Bahrain, Singapore, and here in Washington. The Bahrain and Singapore offices grew out of two regional security dialogues the Institute has pioneered over the last decade or more, the Manama Dialogue for the Middle East and the Shangri-La Dialogue for the Asia Pacific. The Institute has also publishes Survival, an academic journal of international affairs, the annual Military Balance, as well as the Adult book series, some of which are on display in the back of the room for those of you here in the room. This office, the IISS US, is a critical part of the IISS network. We seek to both bring a global perspective here to Washington and to convey Washington's perspective to a sometimes skeptical international audience. Today's discussion will be very much the former, and we're quite privileged to have our colleague Emil Hokayem here from the IISS Middle East office to share his insights on the tragedy continuing to unfold in Syria. Before I introduce Emil properly, I should also mention that the IISS is a membership organization, and that those of you in the audience today who are interested can learn more. There's some flyers in the back table, or you can speak with me after the event. Those of you following online or on TV can also visit our website, iiss.org, to learn more. The structure for today's events will be the following, fairly simple. Emil will be providing some remarks for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I will be turning to you to moderate the question and answer session. Prior to joining the Institute, Emil was the political editor and international affairs columnist for the Abu Dhabi-based English language newspaper, The National. From 2004 to 2008, he served as a resident fellow at the Stimson Center's Southwest Asia and Gulf program here in Washington. He was researching strategic security and political issues in the Gulf and the Levant, things he still does for us. Emil has written extensively on Iran-GCC relations, regional security in the Gulf and Levant security. He has testified in front of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee on Syria and Lebanon, and spoken on Gulf affairs in front of various government and non-government audiences. Emil is embarrassed. He wants to cut to the chase and begin his talk. So I will leave his introduction there and let him take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be back in DC, primarily because it gives me an excuse to run away from the horrid warmth of the Gulf these days. No one wants to be there at this time, but it's also Ramadan, so Ramadan Kareem to anyone, to all Muslims and people. I can report that there is a new game in town when it comes to Syria. It's the search for the new and perhaps more derogatory acronym for ISIS, Daesh. Actually, if you're on Twitter or if you read Arabic, etc., that's perhaps the funnest thing happening in the Arab world these days. Aside from that, it's all pretty sad. So I do encourage you. I mean, in Arabic, Daesh or ISIS is Dawla al-Khilafa al-Islamiyya. There are many ways one can play with those letters, put them together to actually find something that will make al-Baghdadi and other fume a bit more, because Daesh was already pretty extreme in their and insulting in their perspective. But what I'm going to do in this presentation, because I expect that there will be many questions about ISIS or IS, the Islamic State at this point, or the regional fallout and spillover and U.S. policy, I'm going to focus on Syria, because when I look at the current debate, I mean, Syria has fallen off the radar. Iraq has taken prominence in the public and policy debates, and what's happening inside Syria is often not well analyzed, or there's not much great interest. I mean, just look at the number of journalists who flew to Baghdad, and which makes total sense, compared to the coverage of Syria. Well, of course, Syria is a lot more dangerous place. But still, on balance, what's happening inside Syria is not getting nearly enough the coverage and the policy attention it deserves. So I'm going to spend most of my time doing that because I think it's fundamental to understand what's happening there, because the ingredients for the conflict are there to last many more years. And we saw in Iraq that the spillover cannot be contained. Containment is not a strategy, it's an avoidance strategy, actually. Let me start by making a few points of warning, actually. The first one is that there is a tendency to embrace broad narratives when it comes to Syria too easily. In late 2012, early 2013, the narrative was that the rebels were winning and the regime was collapsing. In recent months, it's the opposite. The regime is winning and the rebels are collapsing. Both are understandably tempting narratives, but they're also simplistic. But because they ignore secondary level developments that have a direct impact over time on the big picture. In late 2012, early 2013, when the regime was indeed weakening, it was also reorganizing to push back. And it did so pretty well. 2 months ago, however, the regime conquered most of Yabgud and Alamoun, this region alongside the border with Lebanon. And everyone focused on that victory, which is a very important victory. It secured the highway between Damascus and Hamas and Hama. It cut rebel supply lines into Lebanon, etc. But at the same time, people ignored real rebel offenses, and perhaps actually the largest rebel offensive in the north and in the west in almost a year. So when it doesn't fit the broad narrative, we tend to ignore those facts. There's another point of warning. It's important to resist the temptation of being intellectually lazy. My comment here referred primarily to the tendency to describe the Syrian conflict first and foremost as a proxy war. And I say this for two reasons. First, there is direct Iranian intervention, so by definition, terminology matters. It's not proxy. There is direct intervention with uniformed Iranian personnel fighting on the ground. The second one is that there is no denying that there is strong regional aspects to the struggle in Syria that exacerbates the violence. But to only limit one's analysis to that is in a way satisfying and convenient, because it allows us to do what we like to do, which is engage in geopolitical analysis. If only the Americans and the Russians could get along. If only the Saudis and the Iranians could get along, and somehow things will be much better. In reality, the local and transnational dynamics of the Syrian conflict shape events on the ground a lot more than the regional competition. Now, to accept this, once you accept this, you accept the limits of our understanding of a lot of those dynamics. It's very obscure, it's much more difficult to understand, research on the ground. It also makes a lot of the tools we have at our disposal much less useful. Diplomacy, arming or not arming, sanctions or no sanctions. This is a problem, is that often our analysis is driven by the tools we have at our disposal other than the other way around. What has happened in 3 years in Syria is the emergence of local and transnational actors that have their own legitimacy, their own way of mobilizing fighters, mobilizing support, building their legitimacy, acquiring resources, developing resources domestically. The conflict today has self-sustaining dynamics, and all the ingredients are there for a long-lasting war. Of course, one can identify disruptive events, and we can go through that later. But in a way, if one looks at the linear trajectory from today, the Syrian war has what it takes to last 5-10 more years. The war economy has created ample local resources for the various fighting groups, whether they're on the regime side or the rebel side or the jihadi side to sustain their own fight. Local mobilization happens along communal lines, but there's also transnational mobilization, which also I'll get to in a second. And small and light weaponry is available in sufficient quantities. Today it's not about whether this weaponry exists, it's all there. Now, there's perhaps game-changing weaponry that doesn't necessarily exist in the quantities or in the hands of actors, some of us would want them to be equipped with. But at that level, all the ingredients are present. And finally, a few points here. We also have to resist the temptation of drawing direct links between rebel groups in particular and regional funders or perceived regional funders. I'm going to give you a very specific example. When Jaish al-Islam and later the Islamic Front came to the shore, if you look at the commentary, everyone said this is a Saudi creation. Okay, why is that? Because Zahan Alouch, the head of Jaish al-Islam and one of the main leaders of the Islamic Front, has a father who's a Syrian cleric who's lived in Saudi Arabia for a long time. Therefore, it was natural that somehow it was a Saudi creation. Except that the father of Zahan Alouch is actually close to the Sahwa in Saudi Arabia, which is the quasi-Muslim Brotherhood Saudi affiliate, which was at odds with the Saudi government for a very long time. And in fact, it was very difficult to get Saudi officials and the supporters of Alouch and the Sahwa and Jaish al-Islam to come together. Of course, they agreed. There was a quid pro quo, an arrangement over time. But there is no direct relationship of control, command, etc. between those various groups. Now, it makes our analysis easier if you assume that, but the reality on the ground tells us a pretty different story. Another example has to do with Ahrar al-Sham and Saudi Arabia. Ahrar al-Sham is a Salafist organization, a pretty formidable force, actually. I mean, it's a weakening these days. But the fact that it's Salafi doesn't necessarily mean that they report to Saudi Arabia. I mean, those who are familiar with Salafi ideology know that it can be all over the place. I mean, and Salafism in Saudi Arabia accept the rule, monarchical rule because of very specific circumstances. But there are many other Salafis who actually resist that. And Ahrar al-Sham has still an ideology in flux. They haven't really decided where they are. So again, drawing that simple relationship between a state funder or a perceived or assumed or alleged state funder and a rebel organization is too obscures more than it helps analysis. So today, and this is going to be the crux of my the rest of my presentation, what we're witnessing is the de facto self-partition of Syria and Iraq, but I'm no Iraq specialist, so I'm not going to go there. It's going to be, it is a process that is extremely bloody, but over time, it's likely that levels of violence will drop because enough people will have been killed in the places where they were present, etc. There will be forced or voluntary cleansing, movement of people, which is already happening. We're talking about around 7 million IDPs and 3 million refugees plus. But this will make a political settlement much less likely. We will probably see quid pro quos, arrangements on the sides, but the settlement in and of itself is much less likely today than ever before. Now let me turn to the regime a little bit. At present, my assessment is that the regime of Bashar al-Assad is in a better situation than it's been at any point since early 2012. Let's be honest about this. Its survival is no longer threatened in the medium term. The pressure on Damascus is at its lowest in 2 years. Aleppo is being encircled, and Hamas has been largely reconquered. The June election was Assad's political horizon all along. He saw the election as not only a show of defiance and cohesion legitimacy to fire up his constituency, but also as a way to court, but also force the hand of fence-sitters. There were many people inside Syria who had not necessarily picked sides. We like to think that it's a totally polarized environment, but you had many urbanites, many actors in segments of Syrian society that were in a state of denial, dejection, despair, etc., and didn't really want to be forced to take a stand, be with someone. And in fact, the election was useful for Assad in a way that it actually put pressure on this constituency. For 2 months, you had a build-up to the election, visually, banners, it's colorful, people are demonstrating, etc. There was something to get excited about, or be forced to be excited about. And in a way, it has worked in the short to medium term. It has allowed Assad to begin the process of rebuilding the pretense that he leads a state, and I'll get to this in a second. The reality is that the Assad regime has also retained a military edge over its foes inside the country. It has rebuilt its helicopter force. It has actually adapted militarily. There are downsides to it, and I'll talk about this in a second. But today it remains the dominant military actor inside Syria. The regime goals were to conquer areas where it matters, the central corridor, but to conquer territory, not people. And this is a fundamental point and explains the military strategy that it pursued. What Assad sought to do was to conquer important territories and push out people of important areas. He didn't want to commit the political, economic resources to regain the loyalty of people. It may have been impossible to start with, but why spend precious resources at a moment where you're fighting for your survival in trying to win back the loyalty of people who have suffered so much? And this is a key point. By doing this, he shifted the burden on rebels, on international agencies, on neighboring countries, on the Friends of Syria, etc., to take care of massive numbers of people, and created paralysis on that front. So my point here is that the humanitarian tragedy, rather than being the unfortunate outcome of the fighting, as is often portrayed, is actually the result of a deliberate regime strategy. And this is a key point that is not well understood, because we like to see civil wars as gray events where everyone is bad and let's not take a stand. Well, the reality is that the regime has pursued this as a way to debilitate its foes. Now, that being said, there are challenges ahead for Assad. The first set of challenges is the following. A necessary condition for the survival of the Assad regime was its transformation from a state into a collection of militias. In fact, Assad could not have militarily countered the rebels by just operating as a conventional military, deploying its fighting conventionally against all these rebel forces. He had to build a more loyal but also less costly units to support the fight. So he encouraged the development of locally based militias that are loyal to the regime, but have their own behavior, their own set of interests. They develop their own behavior and own set of interests over time. They start differentiating themselves from the regime over time, and some of them are more radical, some of them are less radical. I'll give you very specific examples over time. There's a clash of interest with regime forces. There's a clash of doctrine, of loyalty, of organization between those various elements. Over time, I suspect that this will erode the coherence and sense of purpose of the groups aligned with Assad. But this is not a short-term problem for Assad. Those frictions are manageable in the long term. I'm going to give you a couple of examples that capture this point. You remember in February, there was the UN settlement in Hamas to get civilians and fighters who had agreed to relinquish their weapons out of the besieged areas of the old city of Hamas. Under pressure from very angry Alawites in Hamas, who felt that a deal was uncalled for, the local commander of the National Defense Force, which is one of those militias set up, Sakir Rustam, opposed the initiative. And actually they shot at the UN mission, and it was very difficult to implement. And Assad had to send one of his top security officials from Damascus to make it happen. And it was actually a pretty problematic process in terms of Assad showing that he controls the ground and he controls the militias that say that they fight in his name. In the province of Latakia, the NDF and another group called Muqawama Syria, led by Ali Kayali, have operated largely independently from the Syrian military, the conventional forces, which led to a lot of confusion and military setbacks, including the Armenian village of Assad. I mean, it's not just that the rebels and some of the radical among the rebels did well militarily. It's just that the forces supporting Assad didn't communicate well, they didn't have a sense of the battlefield, and that was very problematic. In the south, the Druze elements of the National Defense Force see themselves as a local protection force. They don't want to be involved in the fighting in nearby Deraa and other places. And actually, they've resisted Assad orders to go and fight at times. My point is that in the short term, these frictions are manageable, and we shouldn't overstate them. However, this poses a problem as Assad tries to rebuild the pretense of a functioning state inside Syria. Because this is a challenge in the new period. Assad has to engage in some degree of stabilization and reconstruction to show to all these fence-sitters, to all those urbanites who look at him as a better alternative than the rebel, that he can deliver. Well, that necessitates a vision, it necessitates will, it necessitates a strategy, and it necessitates resources. And if you believe that the cost of the fighting was already massive in Syria, wait until you see the cost of reconstruction. I mean, all of us who have seen civil wars and reconstruction afterwards, etc., know that reconstruction can be actually more costly than the fighting in of itself. Lebanon being a great example of that, or Iraq, etc. Who's going to provide that? How do you actually convince the local actors who have risen to support Assad in his moment of need to actually accept a centralization strategy here? These are groups that expect revenge, rewards, respect from the central authorities that are weakened. Another problem here is that Assad's dependence on foreign supporters, Hezbollah, Ahl al-Haq, the Iranians, etc., erodes his claim to actually embody a sovereign, legitimate state. In fact, actually, if I was looking at some YouTube videos from these Shia radical groups, the jihadi groups, and one of them shows fighters dancing with their Kalashnikov and chanting, "We are not here for Bashar, our concern is the Shias." And these groups need to broadcast their successes, their presence, etc., to mobilize at home, to recruit, to build a narrative that they're fighting for the broader good of the Shia community. Well, that erodes Assad's pretense of being a nationalistic secular state, which is so fundamental. Let me quickly touch on 2 points, the ISS phenomenon and how it plays inside Syria. The ISS phenomenon is the best example of local and transnational dynamics at play. ISIS is not a creation of Saudi Arabia, despite the wildest conspiracy theories. It is a product of the failing governance and the polarization in Iraq and in Syria. Its growth and its reach were not just predictable, they were predicted. I mean, not necessarily surprised by this. Today, what we're seeing is the effective merger of Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, and a constant movement of money, resources, fighters across The real surprise is that ISIS, which at first posed it, or pretended to be a vanguard organization, today has announced that, perhaps too soon, that it tends to be a state. I think this may actually be the downfall of ISIS. And, a state is much more vulnerable to pressure. You suddenly you have buildings, and you are expected to provide services. You create expectations. And this is actually one of the very contentious points inside the Syrian rebellion. Does Assad benefit from ISIS's growth and the realization, worldwide of the ISIS threat? I was talking to a few regime associates recently, and they have very mixed views on this. Some of them say, yes, it benefits Assad. First, it validates the narrative that Assad had broadcasted ever since 2011. There is a "I told you so" factor. If only you had listened to us, and we could have avoided that. Assad welcomes the focus on counterterrorism. This is a language that he masters. He's done so during the Iraq War. He thinks he and his intelligence services can do a pretty good job at it. There is an expectation that there will be tactical cooperation with some rebel groups that are under pressure from ISIS. You start by tactical cooperation, and then you go to those famous truces and ceasefires that we've seen left and right. I'm not sure this is a sustainable strategy or what will happen. And the debate in the West over what to do about ISIS is a source of delight for a number of Assad associates. Just today, Les Gelb had yet another op-ed in the New York Times arguing for Western cooperation, direct cooperation with Assad against ISIS. And this is good for regime morale in a way. Others argue that no, it's not good news for Assad. That actually Assad has failed so far to get Westerners to embrace his view of the threat. And I think here there's we should give credit to John Kerry in saying I have a lot of bad things to say about U.S. policy, but on the specific point, I think there's a good conceptualizing of the problem. When John Kerry says Assad cannot be a solution against ISIS because he's a magnet for terrorism. This word magnet actually encompasses, or captures well the dynamics at play. There's a lot of frustration among regime associates that this narrative hasn't really taken hold in the West. There's also strain on allied Shia militias, that have to fight on several fronts today. Iran today has inherited two failing regimes in Iraq and Syria. Massive investment. Can they do it? Iraqi militias, they have to decide, do they protect just Sid Zainab, or do they go back to protect Samarra and Karbala and Najaf? So the news is not necessarily good for Assad, but all these are medium to long-term considerations. In the short term, the regime is on solid ground. Let me end here. Spoken for much longer than I should have. Sorry, Bryce, but thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Emil. That was fantastic. I'm sure there are a number of questions in the audience. We'll do them one at a time. Please wait for the microphone to come your way. And please be sure to identify yourself and your organization. We'll start right here in the middle, the woman.
And the microphone. Okay. My name is Janine McKay. I'm a member of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and I'm here. But my question, I want to get some specifics on Syria and the amount of movement of the people who've been kicked out. In terms of the total population, how many are out? Just to kind of get a sense of the specifics of it. That's my question.
Sure. Well, the numbers are quite frightening.
Yeah.
We're talking about around 3 million refugees, 3.5 million refugees, and around 7 million IDPs, internally displaced people. Many of those IDPs are actually located in refugee camps in the north of Syria, and they're difficult to access. There are also another set of dilemmas when it comes to UN-provided help, whether to provide the help directly across borders with the risk of alienating the Assad regime. There are a set of legal considerations, perhaps considerations that should be overcome according to a number of international humanitarian law experts recently, because the help is not making it this way. Look, the numbers are beyond frightening. The magnitude of the crisis is stunning. It's much bigger than what we saw in Iraq at its worst. There's another related problem, which is the housing infrastructure has been very, very badly damaged. I mean, again, it doesn't compare to Iraq 2003, 2010 because of the nature of the fighting. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled down. The numbers I have are that around 50% of housing infrastructure in Hamas, Aleppo, etc., is totally gone or very heavily damaged. So even if the fighting were to stop tomorrow, we're talking about a 5-10 year process to rebuild the number of units that are needed, and that's assuming that the money will flow, and where will it flow from? And I mean, that's okay. I mean, Syria is a conflict that has erupted at the worst possible time. You talk to NGOs, other people active in providing relief, and they basically say they're meeting only 25% of the needs. It's just heartbreaking. But my fundamental point here is the humanitarian tragedy is a deliberate regime strategy. It's not the unfortunate outcome of the fighting. And until we totally accept this, we're not going to make much headway. UN Resolution 2139 was adopted several months ago. Practically, nothing has been implemented. Valerie Amos and other UN officials are despairing about this. And there's been no progress in terms of direct delivery of aid to rebel-held areas where you have millions of displaced people.
And what is the total population then of Syria?
22 million.
22 million. So we're saying
10%.
Oh my God.
50%. Sorry.
Oh. What's going to be left? What's going to be left?
James Vanderbilt, Johns Hopkins University. At this point, what are the two sides fighting for? In other words, do the Sunnis expect to push the Alawites to Latakia? And likewise, do the Shia, both in Syria and Iraq, expect to retake Sunni territory that has been lost? What is the near-term goal? And obviously, what should the U.S. hope for as a solution, and how should it achieve that?
I think the various groups have adjusted their expectations. I think that Assad and his allies don't hope that they can retake all the territories that's been lost. And anyway, why waste those resources conquering land that is barren and where you have millions of refugees that you would have to take care of, etc. So the point is really to secure this area, make it economically viable, because it's not necessarily economically viable. I mean, those who know the geography of Syria know that wheat fields are in one place, oil fields are somewhere else. People talk about the Sunni state. Well, in Syria, the Sunni state without a large Sunni city, or a large city, is probably not very viable. Without a port on the Mediterranean, very problematic. I mean, it's difficult to, and this is why I say that what we're witnessing is the soft partition of Syria. None of these units are viable on their own. There will always be a degree of trading, exchange, etc. between all of them. I think Assad has a pretty realistic vision of what he wants to achieve in the short to medium term. His problem, as I said, is maintaining coherence among the various groups that support him, and we cannot take this for a given. We spend our time describing, analyzing, and despairing of the factionalism, the fragmentation of the rebellion we should spend an equal amount of time looking actually at the factionalism inside the regime. I gave you some examples. Again, we shouldn't overstate that, but this is a short to medium. This is a medium-term challenge. The second one, the second issue is, there is a lot of ebb and flows among rebel groups. A year ago, gave a presentation. The big groups that I was in touch with and described were Tawheed and Ahad al-Sham, etc. Ahad al-Sham has taken very heavy losses from that fight against ISIS. Just a quick, I was just talking to a few months ago to an Ahad al-Sham official. And he told me that in 2 months of fighting against ISIS, they took 500 casualties, dead fighters. Guess how many people Ahad al-Sham lost in 2.5 years fighting against Assad forces? Around 2,100 to 2,200 fighters. So in 2 months you lose 500 fighters, and then in 2.5 years you lose 2,000. So the fortunes of these groups vary considerably based on battlefield condition, amount of support, etc. And they don't necessarily have a clear end goal about what they want. Today they're in fight for their survival, and they need to secure territory and resources inside that territory to sustain the fight. They become very self-involved. It's all about their own survival. And this is the opportunity that was lost early on. I mean, where there was a more positive spirit to the rebellion, a forward-looking ethos. In a way, that has been lost, and this is hugely problematic because it's very difficult to imagine a coherent rebel entity in Syria today.
Great. Gentlemen,
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Joseph with Johns Hopkins SAIS. Excellent presentation. Emil, you made the point, it was an excellent one, about the need to be precise. For example, that people say loosely it's a proxy war, and you say no, it's direct intervention. And so what I'd like to do is ask you for a bit more precision when you talk about the, quote, local character of the conflict. And the reason I ask you this is twofold. First, because of the implications. If it's really so fragmented and local, then it seems hopelessly complex. Why would we ever even dare do anything about it when it's fragmenting so much we could never hope to understand it? So that's the first. The second is, doesn't it also imply, make Assad look like more attractive? You hear all these other things fragmenting around, and then you have Assad. So I would ask you to just really be precise about that. I mean, isn't the fact that for whatever difficulties these local units present to Assad, they don't switch sides. They aren't. This isn't like Somalia or somewhere where you go somewhere. It's one clan here, one clan there. They're still essentially each side knows who is its enemy, and they're not jumping sides in an unbelievably fragmented way. There's still a coherence, and indeed, to the extent that it's sectarian by definition, you're talking about groups. So I would ask you to kind of respond to that. Thank you.
Look, let me start with the policy implications of your question, which are saying, as someone who's advocated arming since 2012, arming of the rebels, I have to be honest. I mean, today arming comes at a higher cost, comes with a higher risk, it comes with lower returns that it would have had 2 years ago. So I understand the dilemmas that policymakers are facing. At the same time, these are the same policymakers who 2 years ago turned down those opportunities because of faulty assessments or because of a total reluctance to take the fight seriously. I have many bad things to say about US policy in the past couple of years, but here's the one word: bankrupt. And so I understand the current dilemma, but it's not, the current dilemma should not excuse the policy paralysis and the kind of wishful thinking that happened before. yes, it's unbelievably difficult to maneuver, to navigate those dynamics. But guess what? Today, if you really want to address the ISIS challenge, and we all realize now how big a challenge it is, the best strategy, the only actually effective strategy, is precisely to work with those local actors because of the size of the threat, because they have the legitimacy, because they have the ground and human intelligence to do something about it. These groups have developed a very opportunistic way of doing things. 2 or 3 years ago, perhaps we could have appealed to their ideals and values, and some meeting of the hearts, and these were revolutionaries, and we like the upright. Today, they look at foreign actors and they say, where were you in our moment of need? So make a case for why we should actually help you. I mean, it's become a transactional relationship, and we have to be very honest about this. At the same time, describing this complexity should not lead one to overstate what Assad can offer. First, I don't understand what operationally he can offer. I mean, he has also limited resources. He's focused on his survival. Does someone think that Assad will send some of his forces fighting on a faraway battlefield to rebuild ties with the West? Or does one really think that he has a much better understanding of those jihadi forces than the rebel forces that are already fighting ISIS? So that's at an operational level. At a political and strategic level, working with Assad only validates the suspicions of many Sunnis, including many moderate Sunnis, that the reluctance to help the rebels is directly linked to actually a preference for Assad, for a strong secular dictator. I mean, secular, let's qualify what secular means here. And it's going to be extremely difficult to undermine ISIS and other jihadi groups' legitimacy if we go down this road. This also applies to Iran. The notion that in Iraq, the best ally is Iran, misses the point that this is primarily a political fight. After 10 plus years of war on terror, if we haven't realized and understood that what matters are the local actors that have the legitimacy, the intelligence, the rationale to stand up to those radical actors, then perhaps we shouldn't be in that business altogether, because it's just the few successes that were scored in Yemen, in Iraq, etc., are precisely due to local actors taking on that responsibility. So the question here is, can you create a set of incentives and disincentives for these local actors to join the fight? And the reality is that they've done so without the West and others even asking in the past 6 months. The level of casualties taken by the rebels in the north is massive. And there's no recognition by us, I mean, in the general discourse of that fundamental point.
Scott Edelman from the State Department. Turning for a moment to ISIL or ISIS or IISS, whatever. As you know, part of the problem with the name was exactly what did they mean by Balada Shams. And I was wondering if you see at this point any indication that they're starting to lay groundwork in places like Lebanon, Jordan, amongst the Palestinians, or do they have their hands full just consolidating what they've got now?
Actually, it was very interesting to see that groups and Salafi jihadi figures in Jordan actually welcomed the call much more than actually Syrian rebel factions, the call for the caliphate. In Lebanon, you have one group, Aharasin from Baalbek, that actually welcomed the call, but aside from that, very few actors, and I'm not sure this group in Baalbek represent much. They actually attacked a couple of Hezbollah convoys in previous months. Look, ISIS is on the rise in the region because, well, success begets success. You know, it's the brand that's going up. A year ago, or a year and a half ago, it was Jabhat al-Nusra. These are franchises. People announce their allegiance or their loyalty because they're hoping that they're going to get something in return. It's sexier to say that you're ISIS today than Jabhat al-Nusra, than, you know, Hashab, etc. And as I said, it's opportunistic behavior. But precisely because it's opportunistic behavior, the response should be political. A number of groups have joined Jabhat al-Nusra last year, precisely because of this perception that they were getting more funding, that they, you know, they were scoring military victories, etc. And then they left Jabhat al-Nusra, or they, you know, switched to other groups, etc. And the question is, can you build those incentives and this incentive to combat those groups? Look, al-Baghdadi topic, it's a huge bet. I mean, you know, the announcement of the caliphate. As I said, first, he places very high expectations. Secondly, it's hegemonic behavior on their parts. Many other Salafi and even jihadi groups are resisting that. They're not necessarily convinced about the caliphate or the modalities or the timing or the manner it's done. They see it as very vulnerable in some places. I think it's important to be sober about the military capabilities of this group. I'm not sure they can score sustainable victory. But the point is that they can mount spectacular attacks. They've done it in Mosul and Tikrit. We'll see during the months of Ramadan if they're able to pull off something in Baghdad. They certainly have ambitions inside Syria and inside Lebanon. But again, I mean, it's the debate between and within jihadi and Salafi circles is very heated. There is no massive consensus that the caliphate now and under Baghdadi's leadership is the right way to go. So I wouldn't espouse or you know, the most alarmist assessment. But again, everything depends on the response. If the response is not primarily political, it's a purely counterterrorism one, I think ISIS will strive because it will present itself as being persecuted by all the right enemies.
Thank you for your talk today. I'm Trisha Johnson with the Rumi Forum, and earlier you talked about how the Syrian war does have the possibility of lasting for another 5 to 10 years, and that ISIS also operates mostly out of Syria with supplies and troops. How do you think that the length of the Syrian war will affect ISIS activities in Iraq?
Look, as I said, I'm no Iraq expert, though I have to, you know, quickly develop the knowledge because, you know, this effective merger of those two battlefields. My colleague Toby Dodge at the ISS has written an excellent book on Iraq, and he's reading the lead on that. ISIS has been very good at mobilizing local resources, whether it's through extraction, violence, racketing, or you know, it has actually proven also very good at co-opting or entering alliances with some tribes and some elements. I mean, it's very difficult to believe that the events in Iraq owed nothing to local group. So yes, there is savvy on Baghdadi's part and some of his lieutenants. But the announcement of a caliphate in a way changes the game precisely because of this hegemonic ambition. I actually think that in the medium term, the backlash against ISIS is going to be quite massive. Debilitating, I don't know. But will ISIS really be able to hold a territory the size of Jordan, you know, on the border of Turkey, you know, the Kurdish areas, Jordan, etc. I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful about this. I worry much more about ISIS first becoming a model to other Al-Qaeda franchises in the region, and we start seeing this a bit with the internal discourse inside AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, saying perhaps Baghdadi is right. I mean, there's a different way of doing business, and let's seize territory and let's announce things. But it's taking a massive risk to announce a state. A state is something that is recognizable. Yes, they won't have a World Cup team anytime soon, but who knows actually? ISIS has. I mean, when you look at their social media and their local presence, like Jabhat al-Nusra and others, they organize summer camps for kids, and of course there's always indoctrination and other things, but they're pretty savvy at the level of engagement, and yes, of course, at the same time they nail people in the process, and so it's problematic. But the point is that it's all about the expectations you set and whether you're able to meet them. And yes, they may have $500 million in their coffers, but how do you make sure you get all the amount of food you need in, or the goods that this population, and we're talking about an area that contains around 8 million people, how do you meet their needs? How do you make sure that electricity and water are still flowing? If you're at odds with everyone, and do local deals, are local deals enough? The local deals I refer to are deals with the Assad regime, where actually ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra with ISIS in that case provide crude oil and get refined products because they need gasoline for their trucks and their vehicles, etc. But I'm not sure it's a very viable model.
Hi, Robin Sharf, independent diplomat. Thanks again for a great talk. You spoke earlier about the kind of diminished cost-benefit relationship with the U.S. government engaging with the Syrian opposition. And I was wondering, just in your opinion, from a policy standpoint, in terms of moving forward in the best possible way, how or if the opposition really will play, or could play a large part in the U.S. strategy in confronting the conflict.
I see mainstream rebel groups as an essential element of an anti-ISIS strategy. But this also means that you have to accept their other priority, which is the fight against Assad. You cannot turn to rebel factions and tell them, okay, we'll provide you weapons if you fight first and foremost ISIS, and we ask you to forget about Assad, who, by the way, remains most atrocities and displacement, etc., are still done by Assad and his forces. I mean, as bad as the jihadis are, and they can do a lot worse, the balance of atrocities is still very clearly, the doing of Assad. So there needs to be a recognition of that very simple fact, and not create a false equivalence at that level. Look, the thing with the rebels today, they're under enormous pressure, and when I talked to a few of them just a week ago, and I told them, what's your top priority? And they said, preventing the encirclement of Aleppo. And if the U.S. government and others need to invest in one thing, it's precisely that. The encirclement of Aleppo would be another terrible humanitarian tragedy. I don't know what the exact numbers are. They say between 80 to 150,000 civilians are still in that area. It would be a much bigger symbolic blow to the revolution than the loss of Homs, which was the capital of the revolution. But Aleppo is the place where the rebels hoped to gain in 2012, which was, the entry into Aleppo was a disastrous strategic mistake, to be honest. But they need to continue holding it. And then there's a question of what the rebels can do in the south. There was a lot of hype a few months ago about the southern front that the rebels were organizing in Jordan and other places and going to push from the south and conquer territory and add pressure on Damascus from the south. this has not materialized for a number of reasons. And in a way, it's not necessarily bad that it hasn't materialized, because I don't see how it would have been sustainable. Without air cover, the lesson in Syria is that without air cover, you cannot make sustainable gains in urban areas and shift the loyalty or maintain the loyalty of civilians, something that is key. And that lesson has been learned the very hard way in Aleppo. So policy shouldn't be to encourage rebels to seek massive military victories. It should be about protecting the areas they have, protecting the population against more abuses, about establishing local governance in as many places as possible. It should not be an aggressive offensive strategy because they don't have the means or the strategy to put it off. I'm not talking on the margins, when you have to secure territory. I'm just talking about the more forward strategy. The time for very ambitious ventures is long gone.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're just about out of time. But we had two primary objectives today. One was for Emile to share his insights and deal with your questions. I thought we did very well there. I think we also achieved our second goal, which was to avoid accidentally incriminating the IISS in any double activities. So I thank you all for participation in that. I'd like to ask you to thank Emile for his remarks.